This is Father Joseph Anthony Kress.
And this is Father Bonaventure Chapman.
Welcome to Godsplaining. Thanks to all who support us. If you enjoy this show, please consider making a monthly donation on Patreon. Be sure to like and subscribe to Godsplaining wherever you listen to your podcast. Brother Bonaventure, the backbenchers are back. You know, we're united.
Back.
We're united again. But as we are near the feast day of St. John Paul II, we want to take this opportunity to actually reflect on this great saint. Somebody who has, I think, been very important for both of us in unique ways. And we find this quite often through so many Catholics, that he has had a major influence, but it's always unique. It's always slightly different. And so I think on this episode, we want to take that time to talk about our own kind of devotion and appreciation of St. John Paul II, while at the same time starting to see his lasting influence and impact on him. So, your own faith has its own journey and things like that, which definitely has included St. John Paul II. But what role does he play in your life in that way?
It's funny because when I became a Catholic after he had died, not far after, it was 2007.
Okay.
I'm going to talk about that, but and I always consider myself a B16 Catholic as opposed to a JPII Catholic. Most of the Catholics around were JPII Catholics, and maybe that's how you describe yourself growing up,
pretty much.
a JPII Catholic. And I was B16 Catholic because I came in as a Protestant, and Benedict was the one I read all of his things for Shape of the Liturgy and Ratzinger Report and all of these, and his work on Scripture and creation and his commentaries. So although I attached myself more with Benedict, especially from the scriptural part, I've grown and continued to be attentive to JP2 and how important he's been, especially in the philosophical. He's a philosophical kind of pope. And I wrote one of my papers in Oxford when I was a seminarian. I was writing on, we had to do a morals paper on theology. I mean, these papers are long papers, so you do like 4 papers a year, and these are whole grade. And the paper that I wrote on morals was on indissolubility of marriage, and it was using JP2 and his account of theology of the body. And my dissertation, or they call it dissertation, but it's actually a master's thesis over there, was using JP2, a little bit of communio ecclesiology as well. But I really drilled down on theology of the body and love and responsibility, and his account of marriage and love as a Protestant, as an Anglican seminarian. So I was with JP2 even before he became a Catholic, and he was profound on that. But you grew up with him as Pope, as the kind of thing. So what do you remember? You just remember him always having pictures around in churches and things, right?
I mean, he was
just the Pope. Yeah.
He was always Pope.
Yeah.
I was born in the 80s, and he was the Holy Father all the way through my entire life. So when I hear, when there was any reference to the papacy, there was only one person that represented,
that's right.
Growing up. And that was kind of a cool experience. I didn't realize how special that was, until his death.
Yeah.
And then you had to kind of restructure and rethink, oh, wait a second, the papacy is not John Paul II.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what does that mean, and what does that look like? So it was kind of cool. And, personally, I have Polish blood in me. And so having him be a Polish Pope and not understanding the full kind of significance of that, especially when he was elected, not being alive, or understanding all of that when he was kind of broke that mold as the Polish Pope. But there was always this deep affinity for him, because it's oh man, there he is, a Polish Pope, and thinking that is what the Pope or the papacy was. And then going past that and seeing just his engagement with the world, how well traveled he was. And I know that was a big part of his papacy, and because it was so long, he was able to visit and kind of be
an ambassador to the world by the church. So he was leaving the Vatican in a way and going out and in a sense preaching the gospel and evangelizing just by his presence, and the church was coming out to people to where they were, and presenting the church, not just the kerygma, but the whole itself in Peter himself. I think that's right.
Yeah, it was a really cool experience. I remember early on, I forget the exact year of when he visited New York City. I had cousins of mine that traveled from Ohio to New York City to attend the Mass in Central Park and things, and it was such a great experience to see that kind of sacrifice to visit the Holy Father. And that the Holy Father was coming to your kind of native land, and the response to that was, okay, we're going to make, the 7-hour, 8-hour through the night drive what it is to go see him. So it was a lot of just growing up and thinking, well, this is what the Pope does, and not understand like this is the expectation, this is the baseline, this is what it means to be the Holy Father, this is what you should expect. But I remember when he passed away, I was in high school, and I had just started taking my faith seriously, like a year and a half, 2 years before that. Now, I went to Catholic school all my life, but at that stage was like, nah, okay, this is legit, this is for me, and really investing in my faith. And then having such a deep affection for him as our Holy Father just was an exponential growth. And then he passed away. Were
you in it? I forget what day he passed away. Was it in springtime? I think it was. It was Divine Mercy Sunday, right? The vigil before.
I was going to say he died.
Okay, so were you in school when it happened?
No, actually, I was. Where was I? I was at work. I worked at a local grocery store, so I was at work, and it was on the TV in the break room at our grocery store, and they were carrying the coverage for it and everything. And one of my coworkers, who was not Catholic but knew I was, and knew that I had a strong faith, but it was on 24/7, in our break room, because everybody was watching. And they came running down the stairs and just grabbed me and said, "Hey, the Holy Father just passed." And that was a crazy experience too, to have other people be the kind of messenger, the courier for that. But it was one of those things that you just don't forget where you are.
Well, same with me. Even though I was an Anglican at the time. In fact, I was on a confirmation. I was being confirmed that spring in the Anglican Church before going over to seminary, and I was on a confirmation kind of retreat weekend sort of thing with a bunch of the other Anglicans, and. We were down in Florida, and on, I think it was one of the beaches there, maybe Palm Beach or something. And during this retreat, he passed away, and so the TV was on, and there we were, canon priest from the cathedral. That was my ascending church, and then a bunch of us who were becoming Anglican or what have you. And we were just watching TV and talking about the Pope and how important he was, and was transfixed. So even as a Protestant, you just knew this man was something important and was a great witness, and especially for those of us who were more conservative, you could say, or traditional or something, we knew, and the gospel of life that he, versus the culture of death, you no matter what you thought about Catholic Church, that was something that was profound and influential, and that you had to respect in the Protestant Church. So I remember exactly, we were in Florida watching the news coverage of it.
Yeah, I mean, before we continue this episode, and we have so much to talk about, but I think it's such a great perspective and something, but his influence on those outside the quote-unquote bounds of the Catholic Church is crazy.
Yeah,
it was insane. So as an Anglican, not only just experiencing his death before your conversion to the Catholic Church, but what was his influence? What was how was he respected? Was it kind of always if people were studying his writings, which you yourself did a little bit, was it kind of couched in this way? Was it fully embraced, or was it tread lightly there, you don't want to study too much? Or what was the engagement, or the kind of his how was he viewed from the Anglican perspective?
That's a great question. I think it sort of some maybe a grudging respect in a way, but also the Anglican. What do Anglicans believe? Everything. It depends which Anglican you're talking about. And the Anglican America, the Anglican tradition is pretty Anglo-Catholic and sort of attentive to this. And my cathedral particularly was very, very inclined towards Catholicism. And we had repose of this Blessed Sacrament and all this sort of thing. It looked crypto-Catholic, you could say. So we were more open to him, but I think even in the evangelical world, you could say, the openness to his defense of life and the pro-life points, and his commitment to the gospel, his commitment to Jesus Christ. He had this, Gaudium et Spes 22, Christ reveals man to himself, and this even evangelicals absolutely loved. So we always respected the Pope, and thought he was different than other Catholics, I suppose, because he was so committed to Christ, and he was committed to Mary too. So I think there was a little bit of tension in the way that Benedict XVI was even more friendlier from a Protestant perspective, I think. But it was JP2 just he was everything. So he loved scriptures, he loved Christ, and he loved life, but he also loved Mary and he loved the saints. And so for those, which I think was helpful, it drew some of us in to say, well, if he likes this, then maybe we should pay attention.
It was hard to get around that kind of totus tuus thing.
Yeah, exactly. He ends all of his encyclicals with Mary.
Man,
it's just that's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
So looking at his life, and before we start talking a little more about the contemporary import and even our personal engagement with that, but let's talk a little bit about, as we are wont to do, he's got some Dominican connections. He's got some order of preachers in him.
He does.
I mean, we can't claim everything. That most of it's thanks to Poland.
That's right.
But as a Dominican connection, and what's the influence that our order, our tradition, the Thomistic tradition, what has that had, or where's that land with him? Sure,
and I'm not an expert on JP2 and Dominicans, but I do know this, that he did his doctorate at the Angelicum, so the Pontifical School of St. Thomas in Rome, where Father Thomas Joseph right now is rector, and we have a number of our Dominicans from our province there, and have many come from there. It's a wonderful institution. And he did his doctorate there studying under Garrigou-Lagrange, who is many of our listeners are very familiar with the 3 ages of the interior life, which is spiritual life, which we talked about. And
I think we did that episode. Yeah, for sure.
And it was writing on St. John of the Cross and Carmelite things. So that kind of connection, and you'll see that in the introductory essay to his Theology of the Body. The newer edition talks about John of the Cross's spirituality in relation to this. So he was under Garrigou-Lagrange, had studied the Ange. He has a Thomistic background, you could say. That's the one part. On the other part, his Thomistic background is what's called Lublin Thomism, and it's a particularly phenomenological account, so following from Edmund Husserl and a more contemporary kind of modern philosophical way of thinking, which I want to talk about. But that's one side. So he's not a scholastic, you could say, commentatorial sense. He's not like Garrigou-Lagrange. Anyway, he doesn't write in sort of major premise, minor premise, and conclusions and all that way. Also, Garrigou-Lagrange, I think famously, if I remember correctly, said, writes much, says little.
Yeah,
I was not that impressed with his work and such. I think because of this, John Paul was, of course, a dramatist, coming from action background and such. So while there's a Dominican pedigree, at the same time, his JP2's Thomism is very different than say scholastic commentatorial Thomism, and that gives a pause for some Dominicans, at least, for the legacy of John Paul. They worry that perhaps he's too modern, or he's. But there's a sense that I think he's a good case made that he's a nice fusion, and you could say an appropriation of the Thomistic tradition with some modern elements to it, while not getting rid of any of the bad things. But it's a larger fight about these things. When you get down to the details, there's always some questions.
What's one of the titles for it? It's like Thomistic personalism.
That's right. Yeah, something like that.
And that's where Garrigou-Lagrange is coming as like a commentatorial tradition, right? He's just making comments. Where I think John Paul II, and you kind of picked up on that, he was a dramatist and those types of things, and kind of was able to apply the tradition, never adjusting it. He never.
So some would say.
Yeah. Well, good point. But he, in a deep respect, was like continuing that tradition, but allowing it to apply in a few different areas and making it in a very contemporary conversation.
He also added 5 mysteries to the Rosary. Well, I mean, in 2000, so that after 500 years or 800 years of the Rosary or 700 years of the Rosary, now we have new mysteries, the luminous mysteries. There's always Dominicans always have something to gripe about JP2, and perhaps we gripe too much about him because there's so many good things about him that it still needs to be unpacked today.
Oh yeah, that's it. So let's dive into that. I think one of the things we're going to talk about, kind of where we have our personal affections and his influence on our life. And for me, you mentioned some of them, but for me, one of the things that I continually find myself drawing back to is his first encyclical. The encyclical that was his very first one, it kind of, for me, like, it sets the tone of his papacy. It kind of says, like, okay, this is where everything was going to flow from, and it's Redemptor Homines, where it focuses on Christ as the Redeemer of man. And I think to really, especially looking at his papacy, like you talked a little bit about Love and Responsibility, which was one of the works when he wrote before he was the Pope. But when you're really looking at his papacy, if you can look at it through that lens of that first encyclical, it begins to make a lot of sense. That Jesus Christ is a Redeemer of man, all of them. In its totality, which I think then that is what inspires him to travel so much. That inspires him to write as much as he does and to defend life, and how valued that is to be made in the image and likeness of the Creator. But I find myself, especially the first time I read that encyclical, and I can continue to go back to it, it for me is somewhat akin to sacred scripture, because there's always something ancient but something new in it. Like, I haven't gone back to it and found, like, okay, I know exactly where this is going. I know what he's saying. Like, you can find something new every single time, and I do. So as I was deep in my faith, I had good priests in my life who were encouraging us to read John Paul II's works. But I found that first encyclical, Redemptor Homines, is such a beautiful piece of work, but it also helps to explain and give so much clarity to everything else that he did in his papacy. So, like, that to me is such an important thing. And personally, it helped to build that personal relationship. And understanding his prayer, understanding his thought process, and everything that flowed from that.
His encyclicals. This was a Pope wrote encyclicals. Upwards of 20 of these things, I think. Right? It's like Tiger Woods and Masters, golf tournaments, or Pete Sampras and titles of Federer. But he wrote, and also before John Paul II. The encyclicals were smaller documents, something very readable and something very approachable immediately. They were encyclical letters, imagine the sort of thing you could read out loud in one setting. And JPII decided to make them into short books, basically, because he was a great writer and he was great. He had lots of good things to say, but they were all massive. Some of them massive, 100 pages or something. But they're beautiful, and I mean, Fides et Ratio, of course, is very to a philosopher it's very important, and Veritatis Splendor. Really, his intervention in these certain encyclicals were made interventions into the thought world. So Fides et Ratio into philosophy, you could say, and the faith and reason debate that people were having and struggling in the modern world. And he was responding to questions of the modern world. And Veritatis Splendor was an intervention in the church at the time when there was a question of, do we believe in absolute morals, or is it all kind of circumstantial? There's a proportionalism, consequentialism, kind of different ways of thinking about, and this was during the Humanae Vitae, kind of appropriation or misappropriation. And he was interjecting with fundamental clarity. He was acting as the Pope and Peter and protecting his church and giving guidance through these documents that then were taken forward. And he did this with Ex Corde Ecclesiae, the Eucharistic documents, Ecclesia Christo. And then, there's so many of individual Santissimum Animus, the kind of the social encyclical, 100 years of Rerum Novarum, reflected on communism and the free market. You could talk about that. He was making decisive interventions in a number of different moral, political, but never from trying to meddle in other disciplines, but rather always bringing the light of the Catholic Church appropriately understood into these situations of modern life.
We, just as you're talking, it's like, man, we could do a whole multi-episode thing just on his encyclicals.
Profound.
How profound and timely each one of them was.
Particular moments came with particular interventions.
And what a beautiful thing it was to see him shepherding, right? As Peter, in these very decisive times where there was so much confusion across the world. And that he took to these encyclicals, and it might be part of the reason why there were so many and why he was so comfortable with it, that he really saw these encyclical letters as part of his shepherding role, to be that voice and to be leaning in and saying, no, there needs to be a clear voice, drawing from our tradition, but like actually with the kind of sharpness of a spear into this modern confusion. Well, and I think he was able to be an articulate and approachable voice in time when there was so much radical and even quantitative of like fervor. Like there was a lot of chaos and things were changing so rapidly throughout the entirety of the 20th century, but specifically in the late 20th century when he had the ability to do that, where probably very few did.
He was a post Vatican II. I mean, he was Vatican II, of course, but he was the first long pope after Paul VI. So that Vatican II was the response of the church to the modern world, but it wasn't a stopping point. You could say it was actually like the beginning document of it, saying we're going to make a go at dealing with the modern world in a particular way. And of course, the fallout of Vatican II, historical events never end, so there's always new interpretations of them. And St. John Paul was the one to, I think, give us a magisterial interpretation, a lived-out hermeneutic, a sense of what we were to do when we approach the modern world. I think there was some confusion initially after Vatican II about how one does approach the modern world, whether it's giving directions to us or whether the church listens at all to it. And I think he went with a sense of a sense of Christ, as you mentioned earlier, going out and, of course, listening to people and being attentive to people and meeting them in their particular circumstances, but with an authoritative message and with a confidence and a boldness. Be not afraid, of course, was his opening homily. Open wide the doors to Christ. There was a sense of you will not miss anything if you follow Christ in this very exclusive to the modern world sense of discipleship. Yeah,
there's... we would be remiss to finish this episode or to move on if we didn't talk about him instituting the Catechism, and what a great what a gift that is. I mean, we got it somewhere around, there's catechisms floating around all these books somewhere here. But sometimes, like, as a cradle Catholic and you as a convert, like, the Catechism was always there.
Yes.
Like that was like, oh yeah, we have this. Let's look. But like that wasn't the reality. Like, and what a great gift that was. That he spearheaded that. You were talking about the modern world. You were talking about how he engaged the modern world. We're now post John Paul II's papacy.
Yes.
Now he's a saint, and that's why we're talking, because we love him, and he's assisting us from heaven. But we're also, what kind of engagement does his influence still have with our contemporary context now? Is it, it's a post-Christian world in many respects, but what are we looking at? Like, how does the post-John Paul II papacy still influence and still...
It's what still needs to be done.
Conversation,
still needs to be
right? Done. That maybe he gave us the first taste of, or the opening into. But how does that look now?
Well, this is just my read on it, or what I think is important is that we mentioned a little about this personalism stuff, but the personalism aspect, the aiming of a person's more important now than ever. We live in a world that's becoming more and more impersonal, and also therefore unloving and uncharitable. We've gotten away from the sense of persons as the center and focal point of the world, and he called everyone back to the personalness of the world, that it was made by a person, three persons, saved by a person, saving persons, and that the personal, because of his background with both drama, which of course is a matter of personality and presenting persons. I mean, that's where persona comes from. But also from his philosophy, his attention to this Catholic movement of phenomenology from Edmund Husserl, and of course Edith Stein was Saint Teresa Benedicta of the Cross was in this as well. This Max Scheler, who was one of his teachers, these influences of the looking at the person and intentional acts.
Yeah.
This was crucial for Humanae Vitae when that came out. I think there was a confusion, obviously, and a disappointment and frustration about the document that it didn't really address. It seemed like it didn't address modern concerns, even though it gave the right answers. And his Love and Responsibility in 57, but then his Theology of the Body, his catechesis on the language of the body and the account of this was a response to saying, okay, we've heard you don't like the way we've said this in a way, according to some natural law accounts. Let's go and talk about from the personal aspect. And that's where he talks about what it means to love as a person. And he does, his whole point there, and why it's important to bring back again and again, is that if you understand what it means to love as a person, then a number of things fall out from that. One, marriage is indissoluble. Two, contraception is impermissible. That there are denials not of some abstract natural law or some physical principle of themselves, but for him, even more importantly, they're a denial of the personhood of the other, and it's like lying. You're saying something, but also taking it back. That's that personality. Considering that we're becoming so impersonal and so technical, the return to the person and the acts of a person, of knowing and loving, especially love. I think that can continue to do some unpacking and development and fruition.
Well, it's not only just, as you were saying, like these things that as he addressed contraception and all these other issues, it's not just the denial of things. It's not just saying, well, no. It's like, well, it's the denial of the person. Like these things are harmful and destructive because it's actually denying the person. So the other aspects are about affirming the person made in the image and likeness of God. Like this is why we say no to these things, or this is why these things are impermissible, is because we're no longer affirming the reality of the person.
And the risks involved of being a person, the risks of love, in the sense that with indissolubility, you could say, or any of these strong commitments, they're an offer of the fact that it's risky to be a person, that it's an adventure, that you have to say yes at the wedding, at the altar, and you have to say yes to something that you don't know how things are going to work out. But since you're a person, you can commit to these things, and you can have hope, and it's an adventure as opposed to this overly safe world that of machines or impersonal things. The personal world is, as we know, a risky world. It's an adventurous, it's a dangerous world, but it's also beautiful because of that. And he gave, you mentioned this, the positive aspects. He gave that back to us and said, grab hold of your personhood and take advantage of that.
It's and there's this other aspect of how he's continually in conversation, and why is he so continually important for us, is, coming out of the Second Vatican Council, where it was like we wanted the traditions, the truths of the faith to be in this kind of conversation and addressing the modern man, but we kind of are in these transitions of eras, from an era where the church has a great status and influence that maybe no longer has that. And he was, in many senses, somewhat of a prophet in seeing that coming down the road. I'm currently thinking of a great work by Monsignor Shea, who talks explicitly about this transition of eras, from Christendom era to an apostolic era. And I think John Paul II kind of saw that coming and was preparing it, and really kind of not even just like shifted gears, but man, he shifted gears and smashed that gas pedal for it with his push on the new evangelization, which we talk about, like, is the new evangelization still needed? What does that look like? Or maybe we need a different new evangelization. But I think what his take on it was, the evangelization that brought us to the point that we were is going to have to adjust. And so what we're engaging now, as we, I think, very clearly move into a post-Christian world and very clearly need to change our engagement or our quote-unquote tactics of evangelization, is what he initiated early on, and saying it's going to be a little more apostolic, and we need to think that way. One of the things, though, I think is super, super important, and I think gets missed a little bit with this push for new evangelization, unfortunately gets translated as activism.
That's right.
It's a new activism. We need to do these things, and it's all about this outward engagement. But I think what gets overlooked is the contemplative aspect of new evangelization. You have dioceses that have departments of new evangelization, or people that hold positions as the director of new evangelization, and all that's really good, but it all boils down to doings and things and programs and all of that. If we truly understand John Paul II, who brought this to light and said, yes, we need this new evangelization with exactly what you're talking about, his personalism, right? New evangelization is about a relationship with Jesus Christ, and from that, but that has to begin with prayer.
Yeah, well,
that has to begin with a very deep contemplative prayer. So this is my own little hobby horse here, but I think if you're going to push for greater activity with the new evangelization, there needs to be just as much of a push for like contemplative support. Like,
I want to say
holy hours, people praying rosaries for those that are going out to do the evangelical work.
I want to say with every evangelical activity level, there needs to be a Eucharistic adoration level.
Yes,
and that's both That's both St. John Paul II's push, that you have both an extreme evangelical desire to go out and speak to the world, but also this extreme piety and devotion to, brought back really holy hours and attentiveness to this, and Eucharistic adoration was his big push, of course, in all of in many of his encyclicals, his Holy Thursday letters to priests for us, which is fantastic.
So good.
But you're right. He has another phrase he used, of course, is that the church needs to breathe with both lungs for the East and the West. He's trying to bring that. We could say the church needs to use both of these avenues, evangelical activity, but also Eucharistic adoration. They go hand in hand for them to have a full sense of the Johannine, Pauline, Petrine ministry.
Yeah. Well, as we could talk for ages and ages about, and there's definitely more. Hopefully, maybe more episodes. But we want to thank you always for listening to Godsplaining. Please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Like this episode. Subscribe on YouTube or on podcast apps. Leave a 5-star review for us. If you'd like to donate to the podcast through Patreon, please follow the link in the description or the show notes. And there you can also find links to shop our merchandise or to get information on upcoming Godsplaining events. So thank you for joining us, and like I always say, please share this episode with those that you think would enjoy it, or maybe have some connection or affinity for St. John Paul II that would enjoy this conversation. Thank you very much for everything. Know that you are in our prayers. God bless.